Hello everyone and welcome to the sky this month for September 2023. My name's Paul Martinaitis and this show is brought to you by the Astronomical Society of South Australia. So thank you once again for joining me in today's show. We finally made it to the beginning of spring, so hopefully we can look forward to the nights getting a little bit warmer than they have been. And of course, most importantly, less clouds. So we want some nice, clear, transparent skies, hopefully. So there's some nice objects to look at this month. So the constellation of the month is going to be Aquarius. So there's some lovely planetary nebula in there as well, which some of them you might be familiar with. Also some globular clusters we'll take a look at as well. Jupiter and Saturn very well placed for observation at the moment. And one of my favourite planets, Neptune, is in opposition this month as well. So there's plenty to talk about in today's show. So without further ado, let's take a look at the sky for September. So we'll begin our sky survey in the west. So this shows you the sky as it'll be on the 15th of September at 9 p.m. So a couple of hours after astronomical twilight. So we can see Centaurus and Crux, they're getting a little bit low now for observation, but Ophiuchus is still quite well placed. Scorpius is pretty high as well. So now it's probably a good time this month to take a last look at a good look at some of the fine objects in those constellations. Higher up still, of course, is Sagittarius. That's still really well placed at the moment. And if you like globulars like I do, you can see this is still globular season. So as we look sort of towards the Sagittarius-Scorpius region, we're looking to the centre of our galaxy, and the globular clusters form a sort of a spherical halo around the Milky Way. So that's why when we look into the direction of the Milky Way's centre, that's where we see the highest concentration of globular clusters. Looking to the north now, we can see Pegasus is now starting to rise. Very, very large constellation, particularly that square, the so-called Great Square of Pegasus, especially when it's near the horizon, looks really huge. So over the coming months, that'll now begin to rise higher. And there's a lot of fine objects in Pegasus, including many fine galaxies. So we'll talk about some of those in a future show. But for now, I just wanted to show you a couple of the three objects that really in the northern part of the sky are normally pretty low for us. But this time of year is the best time to observe them because they're pretty much at their highest point for us here in the Southern Hemisphere. So the first one I want to talk about is the Ring Nebula, which I think I also showed you last month. So I'll just remind you that's in Lyra, if you haven't seen it before. Really, it's a great object because it's so easy to find as well. Lyra itself, the lyrebird, has a very distinctive pattern. You have Vega, a really bright star at the bottom, and then on top will be that parallelogram of stars. It's quite a nice even parallelogram, and pretty much right in between, if you move right in between the line between those two stars on the top of the parallelogram, that's where you'll find the Ring Nebula. So that's really a great object for any sort of telescope. It's one of the best planetary nebula. It's got an extremely high surface brightness for one thing. So like all planetary nebula, it will respond strongly to an oxygen-free filter, but it's not necessary to use a filter to have a good view of this object. In fact, sometimes some aspects of it look better without a filter. So as always, I advise you to try it without a filter, and then if you have one, try it with the filter so that you can compare both views. So moving along a bit further to the right now, the other two objects are in Cygnus, the Swan, and that's a fantastic constellation. Really popular in the Northern Hemisphere. Unfortunately for us, it really doesn't get very high, and this time of year is pretty much as high as it's going to get for us. So now's an excellent opportunity to take a look at it. And the first object I wanted to point out to you is the Dumbbell Nebula, or M27. So that can be found pretty easily. So you can see you've got the body of the Swan, the center there with Gamma. Follow it along to the tail, and we come to another very famous object. That's the Beta, or better known as Alberio, probably the most popular double star in the sky. So make sure you take a good look at Alberio. That'll look good in any telescope. And then M27, you can pretty much, so remembering that that outer circle is 4 degrees, if you pretty much sweep, especially if you're using a telrad, sort of 2.5 telrad widths, or let's say 10 degrees, and if you'd go sort of perpendicular from Alberio, so you follow up and then go perpendicular to that line there from Alberio, about 10 degrees, and then you'll come to the Dumbbell Nebula. And that's another one of these planetary nebula. It's huge, so you can see there I've kept it at the same relative magnification in the simulation as we saw with the Ring Nebula, and you can see how much bigger the Dumbbell Nebula is. I might just cut it back a bit. So it's really huge, and it generally looks kind of like a bow tie. So it's sort of circular, and then from the center you'll see these two triangular brighter portions and then dark voids in the side. So it always reminds me of a bow tie, or as you can see where it gets the name dumbbell from. And like the Ring Nebula as well, it has a really high surface brightness. So again, it should stand plenty of magnification to try and bring some of that detail out. And the third object I wanted to point out to you is the Veil Nebula, another really famous object from the Northern Hemisphere. And that again is really easy to find. So the way I would find that generally is, again, go to the center, Gamma Cygnus, and this time we're going to follow the beam across the shoulder to Epsilon, and then you'll find the Veil Nebula just a bit above. So go to the center, Gamma, follow along to Epsilon, and then just move up a bit, and you'll find the Veil Nebula. Now, long-time viewers of my shows will know that one of my very favourite objects is the Vela supernova remnant, and that's a fairly large, diffuse sort of remnant from a star that exploded about 10,000 years ago. And the Veil Nebula is another example of one of these really large, diffuse supernova remnants. Probably, I would say, better and brighter actually than the Vela one. So in the Southern Hemisphere, we're really lucky because we can look at the Vela supernova remnant, and also the Veil Nebula is high enough to get a pretty good view. So I'll just zoom in. And this is one of these objects. So remembering that that outer circle is really 4 degrees, so you're not going to fit the whole thing in one field of view. I would generally use fairly low magnification, maybe in my 12-inch, perhaps 60, 80 times. And it is an object that really lights up with a filter. Without a filter, it's relatively dim, but with an oxygen-free filter, just like with the Vela Nebula, it really lights up and brings out that detail. So I would just start going on in the outer circle, and then I'd just gently sweep around and just enjoy all of the little details and the fine filaments. You'll find some portions of the nebula are much brighter than other portions, but it's a really fantastic object, and if you haven't taken the time to look at it before, I strongly recommend that you can do that. Only main requirement is it's one of these objects that does definitely need a dark sky, otherwise it'll just be obliterated by the background. So looking to the east now, so there's Aquarius. That's going to be our constellation of the month. We'll look at a couple of objects in there. But the key object, of course, temporarily at least, in Aquarius at the moment is Saturn. So really well placed. It was in opposition last month. So during September, it's still really relatively bright, and of course still has a large diameter. And it'll be good for viewing throughout September and well into October and November as well. Looking higher up, there's Grus. So remember the Grus quartet. That's really well placed at the moment from viewing. A little bit lower down, we have Sculptor and Phoenix and some of the fine galaxies around that region. In particular, some of the ones you won't want to miss are NGC 55 NGC 134 and NGC 300. They're just some of the few of the many galaxies in that part of the sky. And a little bit lower down we can see Fornax is starting to make an appearance as well. So as the year moves on towards November, December time, I'm really looking forward to talking about some of these galaxies in that part of the sky. Taking a look now towards the south, and we can see things are sort of starting to come full circle, so to speak. So Centaurus is now sort of descending, and while that descends, on the other side of the south celestial pole, we can see Carina is starting to rise again, along with Dorado and Reticulum as well. So, and again, some really nice objects in that part of the sky as well, which we'll talk about when they're a little bit better placed. And then moving up a little bit higher, we can see the high southern sky is dominated by Pavo the Peacock. And the key object really, while you're in that part of the sky, is of course to take a look at the Great Pavo Globular, NGC 6752, one of the 4 top globular clusters in the sky. So we'll now take a look at the calendar for September. So the nights now, of course, are getting a little bit shorter. So on the 1st of September, darkness began at 1921 and went right through to 5:10 a.m., 5:10 in the morning. By the end of September, the darkness will begin a little bit later at 1943 and go through to 4:30 in the morning. So the dark sky period, where the moon won't interfere with our deep sky observations, began on around Tuesday the 5th, and that'll go right through to at least Sunday the 17th of September. So the moon phases, last quarter is on the 7th, new moon is on the 15th, first quarter will be on the 23rd, and the full moon will be on the 29th. So looking at the solar system now, we'll begin by looking at the interior planets Mercury and Venus. And you can see at the end of August or beginning of September, both planets very close to conjunction with the Sun. So more specifically, Mercury is moving into conjunction and Venus is coming out of conjunction as September proceeds. So towards mid to late September, Mercury, although it's coming out of conjunction, still very close to the Sun's glare, because it's in the close part of its orbit. So really not a great apparition for Mercury. We're best waiting until another apparition where it's on this part of its orbit, where it'll be much further away from the Sun. Venus, on the other hand, will be quite nicely placed towards the end of the month for viewing in the morning sky. So in the preceding 3 or 4 months, we've been used to it as an evening object. Now it's gone through conjunction and it's re-emerged as a morning object. Moving a little bit further out to Mars, you can see as well that's really now caught in the Sun's glare. So really, time for observing Mars, of course, is pretty much over. Not only is it far away and getting further away, it's starting to move behind the Sun. And in fact, it'll be in conjunction with the Sun in November. So, moving a little bit further out, let's now take a look at the outer planets. So I'll just swing us around. So maybe we'll look this way. So we've just moved a little bit past last month's opposition with Saturn, but we're still quite close. So Saturn's still really well placed, and it will continue to be so for the next couple of months. Jupiter also really well placed, and of course will become better and better as we head for that opposition in November. Neptune reaches opposition this month, so that's also really well placed. So really Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, all ideally placed during September, and will continue to be well placed for the next couple of months. And finally we have Uranus. That's rising quite late, I think around 11 p.m. at the moment. And that will also be in opposition in November. So we'll now take a look at a few of the sky lineups for some of these objects. So here's a view of the sky as it'll be on the 10th of September. So as we saw early in the morning, so this is around 5:30 a.m. on the 10th of September. So you'll find Venus in the early dawn sky, and also it'll be a lovely crescent moon at that time as well. So not to be missed. And you can see at this time too, the phase of Venus is actually quite narrow, matching the slender crescent of the moon. So worth getting your telescope out if you can. Any small telescope will show the phase of Venus. And if you've got a pair of good binoculars, it's also quite possible to see the phase through binoculars. It's just when you do so, you need to just make sure that you steady your arms against the wall of a building, or perhaps the roof of a car or something, to try and get the wobble out of the instrument. And you should be able to make out that phase. So as we saw, Saturn, that's in Aquarius, and it will be pretty much for the entire month. So this shows you Saturn at 11 p.m. Really nice, still nice and high up in the sky. And finally, there's Jupiter. So this shows you where Jupiter will be on the 15th of September. So at the moment, Jupiter's rising quite late. So to get a good view of it, you'll probably need to look at it in the dawn hours. So this shows you its position at around 3 a.m. in the morning on the 15th of September. And again, just like Saturn, of course, not only is the planet itself well worth viewing, but it has its family of planets, which really form their own little solar system. And starting from next month, we'll discuss some of the events that occur with these moons, such as eclipses, transits and shadow transits, which are really interesting to observe. So this month presents a fantastic opportunity to view Neptune. Not only is it at opposition, so it's just a touch brighter perhaps than it would be normally for us, but the other thing is it's relatively easy to find because it happens to be near a relatively bright star, 20 Piscium. So if you haven't seen Neptune before, and particularly if you haven't got a setting circles or a go-to telescope, it's a really good time to find it. And it's one of my favourite planets. Not sure why, because of course when you look at it through the eyepiece, it's really just a tiny blue ball. But I think it's just appreciating that you're seeing one of the furthest solar system objects that you can readily see with a telescope. It just makes it fascinating, I think, to find and satisfying to look at it. And besides which, on a really good night, it has a beautiful deep blue colour to it. So I've just shown you the general location where it will be. So this shows you on the 10th, which is the day of opposition at 9 p.m. But Neptune, from our point of view, moves very slowly through the sky, so it won't change its position much throughout September to any great extent. So the star we're after is 20 Piscium, and you can see that it's kind of halfway in between the circlet of Pisces on the left, that circle of stars, and the tail of Cetus, the whale, on the right. So I'll just zoom into that region a little bit. And I've kind of indicated with Telrad circles kind of where you need. So if you've got a Telrad, you can probably place it directly. So 20 Piscium's a magnitude 5.5 star. So under a dark sky, you should be able to just see it with the naked eye. But certainly you'll see it through a finder, any sort of magnifying finder. So the best strategy would probably be to locate Lambda Piscium, which is a pretty bright 4.5 star, which is part of the circlet there, that circle of stars at the tail of Pisces. And then you should be able to dead reckon your way over. So it's about 6 degrees over from Lambda. And that kind of gives you an idea of how close Neptune will be to that star. So once you've located 20 Piscium, this is showing you a simulated view through a 12-inch. So the apparent field of view, the actual field of view there is 1.2 degrees. So you can see that if you've got 20 Piscium in the centre of your field of view, Neptune should be there as well. And you'll know Neptune because it'll generally have a deep blue colour. And then as you increase the magnification, you should be able to resolve it into a beautiful tiny little blue disk. So while we're talking about Neptune, another fascinating thing you can view is the moon of Neptune, Triton. So I've always found it very interesting to observe Triton. Again, it doesn't look like much. It's just a really, looks like a very faint star, but I think it's just the knowledge of knowing, you know, that you're looking at one of Neptune's moon that makes it so interesting. So you'll need a relatively large telescope, probably an 8-inch or better, a 10-inch or above. So Triton itself is magnitude 13.5. So you'll also, of course, need a dark sky. And the trick to finding it is to, one, use plenty of magnification. So what you see here is a simulated view at 270 times. And that kind of gives you an idea of how close Triton will appear to Neptune. So it'll be pretty close to the planet itself. And the other thing that you'll need to your advantage is kind of to know where to look. So what I've done on this table here is provided the days of greatest elongation. So Triton has quite an elliptical orbit around Neptune. And of course you want to try and observe it on the days when it's furthest away from Neptune. And that occurs when it's towards the north or the south. So I've listed the dates here in September where it'll be around greatest elongation, either north, which in this diagram is towards the top of Neptune or above it, and the south will be below it. So this is a view through a Newtonian telescope, a reflector. So north will appear above Neptune, south will appear on the bottom, and of course west will appear to the right. So to find out which way is west, that's actually pretty easy. All you need to do is stop. If you've got a knob, you just stop moving it. If you've got some sort of drive on your telescope, switch the drive off and watch which way Neptune drifts. And the direction of drift will be west. So once you know what west is, north will be 90 degrees anti-clockwise, and south will be 90 degrees clockwise from the drift direction. So that's relatively easy to work out. Once you've worked that out, you can then look at this table and you should know then whether you need to look to the north of Neptune or to the south. And if you use plenty of magnification and you've got a nice dark sky, you should be able to see it. You might have to use a bit of averted vision, but under the right circumstances, you can certainly see it with direct vision. So good luck with that, particularly if you haven't looked for Triton before. I think it's a fascinating observation to make. So this month we'll be taking a closer look at Aquarius. So it's a relatively easy constellation to find. Aquarius, the water bearer. It's right above Pegasus. So Pegasus, you've got that huge square, the great square of Pegasus. You've got Pegasus's neck, which you can see there as I'm following up the Telrad. And then right above Pegasus are the stars of Aquarius. And another reason Aquarius is so easy to find at the moment is, of course, Saturn will be in that constellation throughout September. So you can have a nice look at Saturn, and then you can enjoy these couple of objects that I'm going to show you now in the same part of the sky. So the first object we're going to take a look at is M2. So you'll find, I'll just zoom in a little bit on Aquarius, and you'll find M2 over this side of the constellation, and it's a really fine globular cluster. So it was discovered in 1746, and it's one of the oldest globular, all globular clusters are old, but M2 is one of the oldest, even amongst globular clusters, and its age is estimated to be about 12.5 billion years old, which is quite amazing when you think that the universe is 13 point something billion years old. So very, very old stars in M2. its distance is about 55,000 light years, but it's still relatively bright. So it shows that it's got a relatively high mass, a lot of stars in it, and it's relatively large in diameter as well for a globular at 13 arc minutes in diameter. And through an 8-inch telescope or larger, or particularly a 10-inch telescope, you can get, if you use high enough magnification, not only is it bright, but you can actually resolve quite a few of the stars across the entire cluster. And the class of the cluster is class 2, so the class numbers for globulars go between 1 and 12. The lower the class number, the more concentrated they are towards the centre. So a really nice globular cluster in any sort of instrument. The next object I want to show you is another globular cluster, M72. And this one's quite a contrast to the previous one. So it's at roughly the same distance, 55,000 light years, considerably younger at 9.5 billion. But you can see it's about half the diameter. So it's the same distance as M2, but it appears to us to be about half the apparent diameter. So it's about half the physical diameter as well. So its magnitude is considerably dimmer at 9.3, and it's 6 arc minutes across. And you can also see its concentration class of 9 means it's much less concentrated. So it looks a little bit more like a grainy, distant, if you like, dense open cluster. So in contrast to M2, this one will appear considerably dimmer. And even for a large instrument, you won't get a lot of resolution. Generally, you'll get some resolution of the stars around the periphery, and maybe a scattering of a dozen or so stars might start to resolve across the grainy core. So these two globular clusters make a nice contrast to take a look at between each other. And I'll just show you where to find M2. So we'll just go back to the sky view. So if we move up the arm of Aquarius to this star here, and if you just move across to there, that's where you'll find M72. So the next object I want to show you is the Saturn Nebula. So not only you can look at the planet Saturn in Aquarius, you can also look at the Saturn Nebula as well. So this is also known as NGC 7009, and it was discovered, like many NGC objects, by William Herschel. And the Saturn Nebula has the distinction of being the first deep sky object that Herschel ever found. So he, of course, became famous initially for discovering Uranus, the first planet since ancient times to be discovered, because it required a telescope to see it, some sort of optical instrument. So that made him very famous. But these days he's more just as famous, of course, for all the deep sky objects that he discovered. And NGC 7009 was his very first deep sky discovery. So it's a planetary nebula, very interesting, relatively bright at magnitude 8.3, and its size is 28 arc seconds, so it's pretty small. So you need to use a lot of magnification to see detail in it. And like most planetary nebula, an O3 filter will greatly enhance the view as well. So through my 12-inch at 188 times on a reasonable night, to me it appeared like a blue-green ball, and it kind of looked elongated in the east-west direction. So that top photo shows you a photo through the Hubble telescope, which of course shows you much more detail than what we can see with our scopes. But that picture at the bottom gives you a better impression of what I would see through the eyepiece. So it looks like an oval-shaped ball, and you can see those two ears appearing out each end. So that's why it's called the Saturn Nebula, because it looks a bit like Saturn at low magnification, where those ears kind of represent the rings. And at 333 times, particularly high magnification, those ears showed sort of extensions, or what they call the antennae, coming out of them. So I couldn't see much detail in the disk, and I couldn't see the central star in my scope, but I believe under the right circumstances, it is possible to see the central star in this nebula. So the final object I want to show you is quite a different planetary nebula now, and certainly one of my favourites, and that's the Helix Nebula. So I'll just show you, there's a diagram there showing you where it is, but I'll just show you here where it is. So it's kind of all the way over the other side of Aquarius, up here. So its other name is NGC 7293. And it's a really fantastic nebula. It's one of the closest, and it's also therefore one of the largest, has one of the largest apparent diameters. So I'll go back to this view here. So you can see how close it is, 530 light years. But take a look at the size. That's 16 arc minutes. So if we go back to Saturn Nebula, that's 28 arc seconds. Whereas now we're talking 16 arc minutes. So that's very big. So remember, that's about 1/4 of a degree in diameter. So remembering that the full moon is 1/2 degree, so the Helix Nebula is almost as large as the full moon appears to us. So that's really amazing. So this is one planetary nebula where you'll want to use relatively low magnification. So I used 62 times in my 12-inch, just so you can fit it in and see some dark sky around it to get that contrast. So without a filter, it appears very faint, but once you put that O3 filter in, that really lights it up. And to me, it looks like a huge smoky ring. And you can see a little bit of irregularities in that ring. And the central area itself is quite bright, quite a bit brighter than the outside of the nebula. And I can also see the outer edges of the ring is kind of pinched at one end, and that's due to that point that you can see there on that photo to the right. Now the central star I couldn't see. It's magnitude 13.6, which is pretty dim, and also because the nebula itself is quite bright in the middle, it'll be very, very difficult, I think, to see that central star unless you have a large instrument and an excellent night. So they're a collection of 4 very, very fine objects to take a look at. And if you include Saturn, there's 5 great things to look at in Aquarius for this month. So I do hope you enjoy them very much. Thanks for joining me for today's show. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you found the information interesting and useful for your observations this month. So hopefully we'll get some nice weather now that it's spring, or nicer weather, and some more clear skies to get those scopes out where they belong. So until next month, bye for now.